So how did a bunch of commies take on a monarchy, its armed police, military, and ultimately win? I've been wanting to touch on the case of Punnapra, Vayalar a bit more, and now I think would be a good time. I'm currently in the process of working on a bit of a secret project that I will probably reveal in a few months' time, but I wanted to take this time to share a very important history that I think we can all learn from. Let me set the stage and start in colonial India. This is a colonial map of India. On a surface level reading, it gives you an idea of which regions grew what kind of crop. You have things you can eat like rice, wheat, tea, and coffee, and rubber, monazite, manganese, everyday common crops. If you really peel back the layers of this document and factor in that the people who made this map, did not plan on living in the region, but instead wanted to reap its benefits from afar, you realize that this is the true perception of what the East India Company and the former British Empire saw in the people of India. Marks for extraction and theft. I've covered some of this in other videos on this channel, so I'm not going to reiterate a lot of it. But here's a quick history lesson for those of you who may not be familiar with Indian history. 1764 was the Battle of Buxar. It was fought between the British and a coalition of rulers aligned with the waning Mughal Empire and the Mughal Emperor himself. Long story short, the British won the war and it ended with the Treaty of Allahabad being signed in 1765. As I'm sure many of the people watching this, especially Indians, would know, this would change everything on the subcontinent with far-reaching consequences that is literally coded into our DNA. The coalition of rulers who had lost Bengal were forced to sign a new treaty that would grant the British Diwani rights. A Diwan is basically a powerful minister or a ruler who had the right to collect taxes from the people. So this foreign corporation had now upgraded from being pirates who seized vessels at sea and killed everyone aboard to parasitic landlords. But here's the thing about being a colonial parasite. You don't actually know the lay of the land, the customs, the people and their ways and whatnot, right? This whole taxation thing is also really new to you. You just want the money and the resources. So naturally, you become kind of an absentee landlord. So after the treaty was signed, a group of white dudes from the East India Company got together and sat in Bengal. They thought about what to do with this new situation they were in. And they came up with this thing called the permanent settlement system, which is a silly name that doesn't really describe what it is. So let me explain. The Mughals used to have this tax collection system in place, just like all kingdoms did, and theirs was called the zamindari system. But the zamindars were just tax collectors under the Mughals. However, with the British and their permanent settlement system, they decided to make the zamindars landlords also, with a land title and a deed, a combination that was entirely new in India. The zamindars could remain landlords on the condition that they met their quota of taxes, which they were meant to extract from farmers who lived on the land and worked the soil. Kind of like what Europeans were doing in Europe, like the whole peasant to lord, lord to king thing. The same system that made people in Europe so miserable that they had to enlist in a navy or a pirate crew and ship off to far off lands to go plunder far off lands for slaves and resources. Being a part of an extortion racket in England got you down. Shaking down the local butcher, not yielding enough money, too difficult and grimy. No worries, join the East India Company. You could become a nabob. A real word, by the way. And that was not hyperbole. That was the actual backstory of Robert Clive, an infamous colonizer. Clive literally ran an extortion racket in his hometown in England. Him and his goons would break people's legs and windows for money. This was the kind of person who got work at the East India Company. Robert Clive literally made himself a baron with the millions of pounds of taxes that he leached off Indian peasants. This is the story, by the way, of many a Bridgerton-like house, if you know what I mean. Grinding by selling fish and chips didn't get you a mansion, but forcing 100 fish and chips sellers to give you 60% of their income, and if they didn't, they'd have their hands broken and property confiscated. That's another story. The British didn't really know if this new zamindar caste that they'd created with new perks and abilities could even pay the ridiculous fixed rates that the company expected them to pay. In fact, over the next decade or so, over half of the zamindari land would be taken from its former owner and sold to a new zamindar, someone who could better extract the peasants for taxes. So the zamindars were really heavily incentivized to milk the farmers for all they were worth. The system spread across North India, and in various parts in the south where they popped up as well, they had their adjustments that had to do with local conditions. In Coorg and Madras, for example, the British had a system called the Riyotwari system, in which the company themselves collected 60% of the tax directly from the farmer. This naturally had a catastrophic effect on farming communities, impoverishing entire regions. The British warped the land distribution systems that had existed in India. Things like inam lands, where it was custom for some rulers to provide gifts of land or packets of land to communities like the Hijra community, abolished. Free land, you kidding? How would the British make money on that? So the British then hunted down trans people and used colonial propaganda to paint trans people as child snatchers, and also legally classified being trans as a criminal caste by itself, and also seized their lands for better use, which is to enrich themselves. They also figured that it was sensible to tax locally made essentials like salt by 90%, while making it illegal for Indians to produce it, forcing them to purchase their own salt from British-approved brands and marks, which were of course produced by Indian hands. Why compete with a 5,000-year-old textile industry when you can just break the hands of the textile workers and destroy local manufacturers? Rice? You guys have too much of that stuff. How about you use the land to make some opium for us? Or else. Western nations don't tend to teach this part of history, and they don't tend to teach that the East India Company was also one of the largest narco states in history. They basically funded the debt they had incurred in maintaining their navy through opium money. They flooded China with opium forcibly grown by Indians. It would change China forever. And I think that's an understatement. It would also go on to cause food instability and insecurity in one of the most fertile mineral-rich places on the planet, leading to multiple famines, killing hundreds of millions of Indians over the span of 40 years. All these disastrous policies implemented by these parasitic pirates created the condition for food insecurity and famine across India during and after World War II, in which 2.5 million Indians volunteered to fight. After India gained independence, various regions now needed to deal with the multitude of ways in which the local industries had been de-industrialized by the British. They had to deal with new land systems that had been codified over time, the hundreds of new castes on top of the old ones that they had to now deal with, all to Britain's benefit, also pushing us back socially. I mean, looking at England right now, man, they really blew that 40 trillion that they stole. Before 1947, the southern state that we now call Kerala was made up of 3 distinct regions: the Kingdom of Travancore, the Kingdom of Cochin, and the Malabar. I'm going to intentionally simplify this point for the scope of this video, but most states in this region were planning on joining this new experiment and idea called India. But the Raja of Travancore and his British-appointed Diwan from Madras, C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, were like, hell nah, we're going to be independent, extracting these peasants for coconut fiber, or coir as we like to call it, rubber, tea, coffee, sugar. This was way too profitable. Sir, but what about the famine? What? There's a famine? Yes, sir. The Japanese have taken Burma. That's where we get our rice from. What? Don't we grow rice? A lot of it was turned into rubber plantations, sir. It's just more profitable. Anyway, C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, the Diwan and the stooge of the British, did a terrible job of managing the economy. The British thought it was a good idea to sell a large amount of the monazite that was present in Kerala, in the area of Travancore specifically, to the US. Why monazite? Well, monazite contains thorium, and thorium is radioactive, and that tends to get the Oppenheimer types really excited. So in order to carry out their plans of maintaining this profitable status quo, the Travancore kingdom wanted to remain independent from India. The Divan was so excited that he drafted up a US style constitution model after the American federal system. He called it the American model. Creative guy, I know. The elite and landlords like the Nambudri Brahmins and the Syrian Christian families might have been happy at this, but the masses of workers and peasants who actually did all the work to produce all these things that the rich leached off of were quite distraught at the prospect of having to continue their existence under a monarch. While just to skip away, people who looked just like them were experimenting with this new idea of democracy and freedom, while they had to deal with this king and a new colonial overlord, the US. In fact, this was not even out of the realm of possibility. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, various American companies had set up in the coconut oil and coconut fiber sectors. Coir or coconut fiber was quite popular among low-income households in America and Europe. They were often used as floor coverings, and they were heavily utilized in the shipbuilding industry. The famine created by the colonial era mismanagement of resources and the planting of cash crops while replacing subsistence crops led to many trade unions and various socialist and communist identified groups to gain mass support. After all, many of these radical groups in the region at the time were bold, organized, half-starved as well, and not afraid to use violence against a colonial oppressor and a complicit monarch. The starvation was so bad in many regions that rice began to be more coveted than gold. In the Malabar region, landlords hoarded rice in their granaries, and they snuck them into the black market with police assistance, so they could profit off the demand during famine time. Farmers who resisted having their rice taken were shot by the police. Aditya Balasubramanian has an excellent article on this period. I'd recommend reading that if you're interested in more details about the famine. The coir factory workers and marginalized caste fishermen from Ambalpura and Cheratala made up a large part of the communist resistance to the monarchy. In 1938, they held a massive general strike that had been brutally suppressed by the king, after which an official Communist Party of Travancore was formed in 1940. Communists of all castes in the area would organize workshops and classes to educate potential party workers and kids in the ideology of communism and even train members in guerrilla warfare. This is where a lot of that World War II experience came in for many veterans. They were able to impart their military training and tactics. In fact, the peninsular island of Vayalar, which is not too far from my house in Kerala, became a de facto resistance training camp. They focused their efforts on factory workers and agricultural laborers, the ones who were most hit by the famine and caste segregation. 4,500 workers in Travancore of Dalit and Bahujan backgrounds had signed up to join the communist movement. And every time I mention this concept of interdining and how important it was outside India, a lot of people look at me like I'm talking about alien technology or something. Like, I think it really goes over people's heads how impactful interdining was in India. You see, before all this organizing with a clear target put on the backs of landlords and kings, activists worked in their own caste communities, pretty much separately. But due to the severe conditions that forced people to hold these interdining events where food, once a marker of division and caste superiority or caste exclusion, had now been given a new meaning as a marker of solidarity. This would change the very fabric of what we understand as Kerala. The quote-unquote progressive Kerala that people talk about online these days, it stemmed from actions like this that might seem insignificant to many outsiders. I believe we can all, including modern Kerala, learn from this period. No matter where you are, what your skin color is or caste background, knowing your target and building power and solidarity across community lines through food, learning, culture, art, that is the greatest human superpower. Their slogan at the time was throw the American model into the Arabian Sea. In 1946, the Travancore communists organized what we call a Jada, or a march of 2,000 workers. Their goal was to protest the increasing food prices. They advocated for getting rid of the monarchy and replacing it with a democracy. On October 22nd, 1946, a general strike was held, a few days after which a clash broke out, which led to the killing of 4 policemen. The very next day, martial law was declared in Alapi and Chertala. Ramaswamy Iyer took over the military and raided communist camps. In Vayalar, for example, he sent a detachment on boats to launch a surprise attack on the communist camp, and basically fishermen and villagers who had been living there on Vayalar Island. The military opened fire on thousands of people and killed hundreds upon hundreds. Didn't matter if they were men, women, children, elderly, disabled. It did not matter. Naturally, violence continued to escalate between the people and the police and the military. The Travancore Kingdom's Nair Brigade alone, which was a caste-based military outfit that the British used as well, they numbered around 4,000. I think the last time I checked it was more than 4,000. And they were well armed as well. The peasantry, on the other hand, were armed with literally hammers, sickles, spears, machetes, and pitchforks. And this is not even like a symbolism thing, the hammer and sickle and whatnot. This is just what they worked with. Anyway, they were severely outgunned, right? But they could not beat the revolutionary spark that had been ignited in this perfect storm of famine and police repression and miserable circumstances of caste inequality as well. The hardship began to affect all castes. It escalated to the point where an assassination attempt was made on C.P. Ramaswamy by another Brahmin, a younger Brahmin man called KCS Money. He attempted to assassinate C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer at a concert. Iyer survived the attempt, coming away just wounded. However, he then fled to Madras and he never returned to Kerala again. And then, a week or two later, if I remember correctly, the king decided to join the Union of India. The idea of communism and socialism and the desire to have worker-centric policies that affected a large section of the population and benefited a large section of the population became incredibly popular with the actions of the organized communists during those terrible, tumultuous times. So much so that when the first election was called in Kerala in 1957, they won quite easily, beating out the Indian National Congress, the party that had essentially championed the independence movement itself. It made it so that the Communist Party in Kerala became the first democratically elected Communist Party in the world at the time. Within a year of taking office, the Communist administration lifted taxes on food and created policies for lower prices. The government also took over rice cultivation in Kuttanad, thereby revitalizing the rice sector. Numerous ministers also revamped education, and they also enacted tremendous land reforms, which, although not perfect and meddled in by the CIA and Indira Gandhi, still made a difference. It's literally why my granddad was able to have a house. But anyway, that's how a bunch of commies essentially took on a king and won.